As flames consume the great library of Alexandria, a nameless poet struggles to preserve the city's wisdom through secret verses written amid chaos. Alongside Selene, a warrior sworn to protect, and Telemachus, an aging scholar, he hides the last scrolls from destruction. In a race against fire and time, his words become an act of rebellion, proof that while empires fall and knowledge burns, memory endures beyond the ashes.
I am a poet, though names and titles seem trivial when weighed against the weight of what surrounds me. Here, in the heart of Alexandria, where the sun spills its gold upon marble and scroll, I have made my sanctuary. The great library, this vast repository of human thought, stretches before me like a sleeping giant, its corridors endless, and its treasures beyond measure. Each scroll, each tome, is a voice from a distant age, a whisper of minds long past but not forgotten. Here, in these hallowed halls, the collective endeavor of humanity is etched in ink and preserved on fragile parchment. I walk beneath towering columns, their surfaces worn smooth by the touch of countless hands, scholars, scribes, seekers of truth. The air is thick with the scent of aged papyrus and beeswax, mingled with the faint musk of stone warmed by the sun. Light filters in through latticed windows, casting intricate patterns upon the floors where generations have tread. The sound of rustling pages and murmured debate forms a tapestry of quiet reverence. It is here that knowledge breathes alive, breathing, pulsing with the promise of discovery and understanding. I have spent years wandering these corridors, a humble witness to the great symphony of intellect that echoes within. The library is not merely a building but a living testament to human ambition, a beacon that draws the curious and the learned alike. Yet, beneath this grandeur, a shadow stirs, the city beyond these walls hums with unrest. Political factions quarrel in whispered councils, their ambitions and fears seeping into the streets like a gathering storm. I see it in the furrowed brows of the scholars, the tightened grip of the guards, the furtive glances exchanged in the marketplace. The peace upon which this bastion of knowledge rests feels brittle, as if one careless breath might shatter it. From my vantage point by a high window, I watch the city bustle beneath the fading light. The harbor thrums with ships bound for distant lands, merchants call out their wares, children dart through narrow alleys, and soldiers patrol with wary eyes. All life seems to pulse with urgency, as if sensing the inevitable. Within me, a quiet storm brews a blend of awe and dread. How fragile this splendor seems when held against the relentless tide of time and human folly. The library, for all its wisdom, is but a fragile flame flickering against the encroaching night. As dusk gathers, I light a small oil lamp, its soft glow casting warm light upon the scrolls piled at my side. The flame dances, casting shadows that leap and recede like memories too fleeting to grasp. In this fragile light, I commit my thoughts to parchment, weaving verses that honor the legacy I am privileged to witness. Words, I believe, possess a strange power, one that may endure beyond the reach of fire and ruin. Tonight I write not only as a poet, but as a keeper of memory. For I sense that the days ahead will test the very fabric of our civilization, and that the fate of Alexandria's great library hangs in precarious balance. Yet even in the face of loss, I hold fast to a fragile hope that knowledge, once born into the world, can never be truly extinguished. So begins my tale, a chronicle of light and shadow, of human endeavor and hubris, of a city whose soul is woven from scrolls and stories. What follows is the story of the burning library, and of the verses I inscribe in its final hours, verses that may yet outlast the flames. Even now, as the city sleeps beneath a sky smeared with stars, I hear the distant murmur of voices, some hopeful, some fearful, carrying on the night breeze. The hour is late, but my vigil has only just begun. For in these moments between darkness and dawn, the fragile flame of knowledge must be tended with care, lest it be lost forever. I do not know what the morrow will bring, but I know this: as long as words remain, so too does the spirit of Alexandria, defiant and enduring. And so I write, with trembling hands and a heart full of sorrow and resolve. The corridors of the great library stretched before me like veins coursing through the heart of Alexandria, a labyrinth of knowledge and memory, where every scroll and tome bore the weight of centuries. The scent of papyrus mingled with the faint musk of dust and oil lamps, a reminder of the countless hands that had touched these pages. Yet beneath the familiar quietude, a whisper of unrest stirred. Rumors of discord had begun to permeate the city, carried on the breath of anxious scholars and servants alike. I moved through the halls with measured steps, my eyes tracing the spines of scrolls that held the dreams and discoveries of humankind. But today, the usual hum of scholarly debate was replaced by a fragile silence, as if the very walls held their breath. In the dim light of a side chamber, I found Callimachus hunched over a delicate scroll, his fingers steady yet his gaze heavy. The elder librarian's eyes, sharp behind round spectacles, met mine with a gravity that rooted me to the spot. "The winds of change are no longer whispers," he said, his voice low and steady. "The city teeters on a blade's edge. We must brace ourselves, for the library cannot withstand the storms to come." His words settled like stones in my chest. The library, our sanctuary, the beacon of human intellect, was vulnerable. The thought was unbearable, yet undeniable. Callimachus spoke of the fragility of our collection, the brittle scrolls, the fading ink, and the dangers lurking not just in fire or sword, but in neglect and the shifting tides of power. I listened, the weight of responsibility dawning upon me. No longer could I be a mere observer, a silent chronicler of fading grandeur. The preservation of knowledge demanded more than reverence. It required action. I felt the stirring of a fierce resolve within, a need to capture not just the facts, but the soul of the library in words that fire could not consume. As I wandered deeper into the halls, the muted footsteps of scholars echoed like distant thunder. Voices rose and fell beyond the walls, discussions fraught with fear, debates laced with despair and defiance. Each sound sharpened my awareness of the fragile peace slipping away. In the quiet of a secluded alcove, I unrolled a fresh piece of parchment and let my hand move with trembling certainty. Verses flowed, weaving the essence of the library's wisdom and the silent prayers of those who walked its halls. These words, I hoped, would live beyond the stone and scroll, enduring when the physical repository could no longer stand. Yet, even as I wrote, the sense of urgency grew. The city's unrest was no longer distant thunder but a gathering storm, its shadow creeping ever closer. I knew that the path ahead would test every fiber of my being, challenging my faith in the permanence of human endeavor. But in that moment, surrounded by the fragile whispers of knowledge, I vowed to become more than a witness. I would be a keeper of memory, a voice for the silenced halls, and a flame of hope against the gathering darkness. The days ahead would demand courage beyond words, yet I clung to the belief that words themselves might yet outlast the flames. And so, beneath the fading light of the afternoon, I set my resolve like a beacon in the gathering dusk, ready to face the trials that awaited the city and its sacred heart, the great library. I write in shadows and whispers, my hand trembling yet resolute, as the hours slip through the endless corridors of this hallowed sanctuary. The great library, a vast heart pulsing with the breath of human thought, looms around me like a sleeping giant, majestic yet vulnerable. Its scrolls, each a fragile vessel of wisdom, rest in silence beneath the weight of centuries. Here, I commit my verses to parchment, weaving between lines the essence of all that we stand to lose. The scent of aged papyrus mingles with the faint tang of ink, a delicate perfume that reminds me of the library's silent promise, that knowledge endures beyond the reach of time. But now, that promise trembles on the edge of oblivion. Outside, the city murmurs with unease, whispers of unrest and flames yet to come. I hear them, the low hum of tension, the clattering footsteps of guards, the distant cries of merchants and scholars alike. These sounds seep through the thick stone walls, as if the library itself breathes uneasily beneath a gathering storm. Tonight, I steal moments from the coming chaos to write, My scrolls are hidden acts of rebellion, secret verses that cradle the soul of Alexandria's intellect. Each word is a flicker of light in the encroaching darkness, a fragile testament against the ruin poised to consume us. I write of the poets who first dreamed these halls into being, of the philosophers whose minds crafted the very foundations of thought. My ink flows with the memory of Callimachus's wisdom, the fierce resolve of Selene's protection, and the soft promise of Nerissa's youthful hope. The library's vast halls echo with silence, save for the faint scratch of my reed pen against parchment. The fragile scrolls, rolled and sealed with care, find refuge in the secret crevices and hidden alcoves I know so well. With every placement, I feel the weight of hope press heavier upon my chest, a secret pact between memory and fire. If these words survive, they may yet outlast the flames that threaten to erase all. Outside, the sky darkens, bruised with the promise of storm and strife. The city's pulse quickens, but here within these stone walls, time seems suspended, a fleeting moment captured between breath and silence. I pause to gaze through a cracked window, the vast expanse of Alexandria stretched beneath a fading light. The salty breeze carries the scent of the sea, mingled with dust and smoke yet to come. It is a poignant reminder of all that is fragile, all that we risk losing. In these verses, I pour my soul, weaving a tapestry of memory and defiance. The words become more than ink. They are a shield against oblivion, a beacon for those who might come after. Though my body may falter, these scrolls, these fragile vessels of thought shall endure. I believe this with a quiet certainty, a faith born not of naivety, but of the enduring power of words. Yet, even as I write, shadows deepen at the edges of my vision. The flames, though not yet kindled, are whispered in every hurried footstep, in every hushed conversation. They are a force beyond command, a symbol of human hubris and neglect, and still I write. Because to cease is to surrender, and I will not surrender the legacy of knowledge without a fight. The hours stretch thin and my hand aches, but my spirit burns brighter with each line. I write for Callimachus, who shared with me the secrets of hidden chambers and lost scrolls, for Selene, whose fierce eyes guard the city's fragile heart, for Nerissa, whose trembling hands will one day carry this torch forward. I write for all who believe that words can transcend even the fiercest blaze. And as the night deepens, I roll my scrolls once more, slipping them into their secret havens. Each hidden verse is a whispered prayer, a promise that though the library may fall, the flame of knowledge will endure, carried not in stone or scroll alone, but in the immortal breath of words. Outside, the distant sounds grow sharper, the city's unrest mounting with every moment. But here, in this quiet sanctuary, I write on a solitary voice against the coming storm, a poet weaving verses in the shadow of destruction. The fire waits, relentless and unforgiving, but so do I, and my words will remain long after the smoke has cleared. The shadows of the great library stretched long over the stone floors, flickering with the restless light of torches held high by scholars and scribes alike. Within one such chamber, the poet found himself seated beside Callimachus, the venerable librarian whose years of service had etched wisdom and wariness into every line of his aged face. The air was thick with the scent of ancient parchment and dust, mingling with the faint aroma of oil lamps burning low in the encroaching dusk. Callimachus' voice was low but urgent, his eyes sharp beneath round spectacles as they met the poet's. "We stand on the precipice," he said, his tone heavy with unspoken fears, not just of fire, but of forgetting. "This library, our sanctuary, is fragile not merely in its walls, but in the minds and hearts of those who would protect it." The poet nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within his chest. Around them, other scholars murmured in agreement, voices weaving a tapestry of worry and resolve. One young man, his fingers ink-stained and trembling, spoke of scrolls too delicate to move, of knowledge too precious to lose yet too vulnerable to save. Another, a woman wrapped in a simple tunic, recounted the city's growing unrest, the the political factions dividing like a wound that would not heal. Their lament was not merely for books or scrolls, but for the very essence of human endeavor, the collective memory and wisdom painstakingly gathered over generations now threatened by forces, both human and elemental. The poet listened intently, his heart pounding with a mixture of despair and determination. Each word, each sigh, etched itself into his mind, compelling him to act. Later, in a quiet alcove shielded from the murmurs and clatter beyond, the poet unfurled a fresh piece of parchment. His hand trembled slightly as he dipped his reed pen into ink, the dark fluid pooling like a promise on the page. He wrote not only to record, but to defy the fragility of knowledge, made all the more poignant by its imminent peril. Every verse was a breath held against the coming storm, an invocation of hope whispered into the gathering dusk. Outside, the city's turmoil seeped through the thick stone walls. Voices rose in heated debate among political factions, their words sharp and discordant, echoing the fractures threatening to rend Alexandria apart. The poet could hear snatches of their arguments, calls for pragmatism, dismissals of the library's worth, and veiled threats carried on the wind. Within these walls, the fragile sanctuary of wisdom, such discord was a bitter undertone to the scholar's solemn reflections. Yet amidst this, the poet found a growing resolve. The laments of Callimachus and his peers were not mere echoes of defeat, but a summons to action. The verses he committed to parchment were more than words, they were a beacon. A fragile promise that the essence of their collective human spirit might endure beyond the physical destruction looming ever closer. As night deepened, the library's corridors grew quiet, save for the scratching of the poet's pen and the distant clash of voices beyond. He paused, listening to the silence that settled like a shroud, before returning to his task. The fate of Alexandria's knowledge hung precariously in the balance, but within the poet's verses stirred the first flicker of defiance, a flame born not of wood or papyrus, but of the enduring power of words. The sun had barely risen when I found myself at the library's outer courtyard, the great stone walls looming like silent sentinels against a restless sky. The city breathed uneasily around me. The usual morning chorus of merchants and scholars was muted, replaced by a tense undercurrent of whispered rumors and hurried footsteps. Alexandria, proud and eternal, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the inevitable storm. I paused beneath an ancient olive tree, its gnarled branches casting long shadows over cracked stones. Dust hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of baked earth and distant smoke. Somewhere beyond the walls, voices rose and fell, a cacophony of fear and defiance. It was then that I noticed her. She stood like a statue at the gateway, a sentinel carved from determination and strength. Selene. The city guard whose name had passed my lips only in fleeting conversations, now a vivid presence before me. Her dark hair was cropped close, practical and unyielding as the resolve that burned in her eyes. The shadows of early light caught the sharp angles of her face, and her stance was one of alert readiness, a living barrier between chaos and order. Our eyes met briefly, and I sensed an unspoken question. What brings a poet to the edge of war? I hesitated, clutching the fragile parchment tucked beneath my robes, a testament to fragile hope. Selene's gaze softened for a moment, recognizing perhaps the weight I carried, a burden invisible to most but as tangible as the stones beneath our feet. Suddenly a commotion shattered the uneasy calm. From the narrow street adjacent to the courtyard, a handful of roughened men surged forward, their intentions clear in the glint of stolen knives and greedy eyes. They moved with reckless abandon, tearing at the stalls that lined the way, aiming to seize what little treasure the city still guarded. Selene's voice cut through the chaos like a clarion call. "Back!" she commanded, her tone unwavering. The men faltered beneath her fierce gaze, as if confronted by a force greater than any blade. With swift, precise movements, she advanced, a dance of discipline and strength honed by years of duty. Her presence was a shield, not only for the goods, but for the fragile heartbeat of Alexandria itself. I watched, heart pounding, as she confronted the marauders, her words sharp and clear. This city stands on more than stone and coin. You threaten its soul. Leave or face justice. The men, cowed by her unwavering stance and the sudden arrival of reinforcements, scattered into the labyrinthine alleys. The courtyard settled back into uneasy silence, the echoes of conflict lingering like a bitter aftertaste. Celine turned to me then, her breath steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "You should not be here alone," she said, eyes searching mine. "These are dangerous times for those who carry the weight of words." I nodded, feeling the fragile parchment beneath my hand as if it were a talisman. "And you, guardian of the city's flesh and blood, what drives you to stand so fiercely at this precipice?" Her gaze drifted toward the towering silhouette of the library, its grand arches bathed in the golden light of morning. "This city is more than walls and warriors," she said softly. "It is memory, culture, the very breath of our people. If those fall, what remains?" In that moment, a fragile alliance was forged not through words alone, but through shared purpose. She was the shield to my pen, the sword to my verses. Together, perhaps we might stave off the darkness gathering like a storm on the horizon. We moved beneath the shadowed corridors of the library's outer halls, the scent of ancient parchment, and ink mingling with the distant rumble of unrest. Celine's steps were sure and measured, each footfall a promise of protection. The stained glass windows caught the fading light, fracturing it into a kaleidoscope that danced upon the cracked marble floors. Our conversation delved into the depths of purpose and duty. She spoke of the weight of a soldier's oath, the sacrifices made to shield the innocent. I shared the burden of a poet's hope, the belief that words could outlast the fiercest flame. Though our worlds seemed disparate, we found common ground in the desire to preserve what mattered most. As dusk folded over the city, we stood once more beneath the open sky, the horizon painted with the first flickers of distant fires. Celine's voice was steady, a vow whispered against the growing night. "I will protect you and your verses, as long as breath remains in my body." I clasped her hand, a silent pledge passing between us. The library might burn, the scrolls might crumble, but in this fragile bond lay a spark of resistance, a promise that the flame of knowledge would not be extinguished so easily. And so, as the shadows deepened and the city held fast against the gathering storm, I felt the strength of an unexpected ally beside me. Celine's resolve became my shield, her courage a beacon. Together, we would face the fire and perhaps, in the ashes, find a new dawn. But the night was long and the flames hungry. The true test was yet to come. The sun had barely risen when I found myself weaving through the labyrinthine alleys of Alexandria's merchant quarter. The air thick with the mingled scents of salt from the sea and the faint, persistent odor of smoke from distant fires. My mind, a tempest of anxious verses and fleeting hopes, clung to a single purpose, to secure the materials without which my verses might remain imprisoned in thought alone. Parchment and ink, the very lifeblood of preservation, were scarce commodities now, their availability undermined by the city's mounting unrest. The merchant's warehouse stood at the end of a narrow street, its heavy wooden doors ajar, revealing a cavernous interior dim-lit by oil lamps whose flames flickered like hesitant stars. I hesitated on the threshold, the weight of what I sought tightening around my chest. The air inside was thick with dust and the unmistakable musk of dried animal skins, the raw source of the precious parchment stacked in towering piles. From the shadows emerged the merchant himself, a man whose weathered hands and cautious eyes bespoke years of hard negotiation and survival. His garments bore the dust and grime of constant travel and trade, practical and unadorned save for the glint of a small, ornate ring on his finger, a silent testament to past fortunes or lingering hopes. "You come seeking supplies in troubled times," he said, his voice low and steady, betraying neither warmth nor scorn. "Tell me, poet, what price are you willing to pay for words when the city itself is on fire?" His words struck a chord within me, a stark reminder that in this place, Survival was a currency as real as gold. Yet, I met his gaze with the quiet fire that had kindled in my soul since the first wisp of destruction reached my ears. Not gold, but promise, I replied, that the words I write will outlive these flames, that knowledge shall not perish even if the walls that house it do. He chuckled softly, a sound devoid of mirth but rich in understanding. Promises are fragile things, he said, but so too is parchment. Our negotiation unfolded amidst the creak of wooden beams and the soft rustle of scrolls being shifted and recounted. I watched as he measured quantities, his fingers deft and sure, weighing the risks of parting with his precious stock. Outside, the murmurs of the city's unrest seeped through the walls, a distant cacophony of anger and fear that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the city itself. Yet in this dim sanctuary, a fragile accord took shape. The merchant agreed to supply me with enough parchment and ink to commit my verses to life beyond memory, on the condition that I would safeguard his interests should the turmoil spill into his world. It was an uneasy alliance, born of necessity, but one that breathed new purpose into my mission. As I left the warehouse, the scrolls secure beneath my cloak, the weight of responsibility settled more heavily upon me. The city's shadowed streets whispered of approaching storms, but within me burned a quiet resolve to etch the fleeting light of knowledge onto fragile leaves that might one day kindle hope anew. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril both visible and unseen, yet with every step I took, the verses forming in my mind grew clearer, a testament to the enduring power of words, even as the world around us trembled on the edge of oblivion. I knew that in the days to come, every scrap of parchment would be a battleground, every line written an act of defiance. And so I pressed forward, the ink-stained hands of a poet bound to a city's fading light, determined to capture the soul of Alexandria before it was lost to ash and memory. The merchant's pragmatism grounded my soaring hopes, reminding me that the survival of knowledge required more than passion. It demanded cunning, alliances, and sacrifice. In this fragile balance, I found a new rhythm to my verses, a cadence shaped not only by dreams but by the harsh drum of reality. And so, with scrolls in hand and fire at the gates, I prepared to write the stories that might one day rise from the ashes, a testament not to what was lost, but to what could endure. But even as I clung to this conviction, a shadow of doubt crept in the question of whether words alone could withstand the coming storm. Yet, in that doubt, I found the seed of resolve. For if knowledge was to survive, it would do so not merely through preservation of texts, but through the unyielding spirit of those who dared to remember. And so the ink flowed, the scrolls multiplied, and the poet's heart beat on amid the encroaching darkness, a fragile flame against the vast, indifferent night. The council chamber was suffused with a heavy, oppressive air, thick with the murmur of voices and the rustle of robes. Flickering oil lamps cast elongated shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the faces of men whose eyes burned with agendas as conflicting as the city's fate itself. I stood at the edge of the assembly, a quiet witness to the tempest of words that would decide the destiny of the knowledge I had sworn to protect. Dionysius, seated at the head of the marble table, radiated authority. His robes, embroidered with intricate patterns of gold thread, caught the lamplight with each sharp gesture he made. "We cannot cling to relics while the city crumbles," he declared, his voice a low rumble but laced with unmistakable fervor. "The library, for all its grandeur, has become a liability. Resources must be diverted to the city's defense and governance, not to preserving fragile scrolls that serve only the elite." A murmur of assent rippled through some of the gathered men. Others shifted uneasily, the weight of his words settling like dust over the chamber. It was not the first time such a sentiment had been voiced, but hearing it spoken aloud with such conviction struck a harsh chord within me. From where I stood, I could see the younger councilman, a man whose eyes gleamed with a hunger for both knowledge and power, rise to challenge Dionysius. To abandon the library is to abandon the soul of Alexandria, he retorted, his voice ringing clear and sharp. Our heritage, our wisdom, it is the foundation upon which this city stands. To let it perish is to doom us all to ignorance and ruin. The clash of ideals grew heated, voices rising and falling like waves breaking against the city's ancient walls. The council chamber became a battlefield of rhetoric, where preservation and pragmatism warred beneath flickering lamplight. As the debate unfolded, I found myself retreating into the shadows, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the future hung precariously in the balance. The faces of scholars and scribes I had met in the library floated before my eyes, their quiet hopes and whispered fears now magnified in this chamber of discord. The scent of incense mingled with the faint aroma of aged parchment and dust, a haunting reminder of what was at stake. I could almost hear the rustle of fluttering scrolls, the soft murmur of voices long silenced by time, urging me to bear witness and to act. Despite the passion on both sides, the council adjourned without resolution. The library's fate remained uncertain, suspended between neglect and the flames that threatened to consume it. Stepping out into the cool night, the city stretched before me, its streets dimly lit and shadows deepening with each passing moment. The flickering lights seemed fragile, like the last embers of a dying fire. Yet within me stirred a fierce determination. Words, I told myself, must become the fortress that withstands the blaze, the torch that carries knowledge beyond extinction. The city was divided, its leaders at odds, but the fire of resolve within me burned brighter than ever. I would write. I would preserve. Even as the world around me teetered on the edge of oblivion, the verses I crafted would be a testament to the enduring power of thought and memory. Tonight Alexandria's soul was fractured, but tomorrow through the fragile, immortal power of words it might yet endure. And so the battle for our legacy continued, not with swords or shields, but with ink and parchment, in the quiet defiance of a poet who refused to let the light of knowledge be extinguished. The council chamber's echoes faded behind me, but the urgency only grew. The city's fate was entwined with the fragile scrolls I guarded, and time was slipping away like sand through open fingers. I tightened my grip on the small bundle of parchment hidden beneath my cloak, steeling myself for the trials yet to come. For in a city divided, the poet's voice must become a beacon steady, unwavering, and eternal. The morning light filtered through the narrow lattice windows of the scriptorium, casting long, slender shadows across the stone floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment, ink, and the faint musk of beeswax from the sealed scrolls that lined every shelf. It was here, in this quiet sanctuary of thought and words, that I first saw Nerissa, the young apprentice who would soon become the fragile vessel of our fading legacy. She stood uncertainly near the heavy oaken table, her youthful face flushed with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she clutched a fresh sheet of parchment, her dark eyes wide and shining with a mixture of innocence and burgeoning responsibility. I could see in her the reflection of myself many years ago, unsure, yet drawn irresistibly to the call of words. "Come," I said softly, motioning her closer. "Here is the verse I wrote last night. It is meant to carry the memory of this place beyond the reach of flame." Nerissa stepped forward, her breath catching as she lowered herself onto the wooden bench. I placed the delicate scroll before her, its edges curling gently from the weight of countless hands. The ink still glistened faintly, the letters flowing like a river of thought across the surface. "You must copy it exactly," I instructed. "Each word, each stroke, must be preserved as if it were a living thing." Her fingers reached for the reed pen, dipping it cautiously into the inkwell. The dark liquid clung to the tip, ready to inscribe the fragile truths onto the blank canvas. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then began to write, her hand unsteady but determined. I watched as the first letters appeared, imperfect yet imbued with a quiet reverence. Occasionally, she paused, glancing up at me with a question in her eyes. I offered gentle corrections, guiding her hand when the ink smudged or the stroke faltered. It was a delicate dance, the passing of knowledge from one soul to another, fragile as the parchment yet potent as flame. Outside, the city stirred with restless energy. The distant clang of metal raised voices, and the low murmur of crowds seeped through the thick walls, reminders of the turmoil that crept ever closer. Yet within these stone confines, time seemed to fold, holding itself still for the sacred act of preservation. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden beams upon the dust motes that danced like tiny specters in the air, Nerissa's confidence grew. Her strokes became bolder, the words flowing with increasing grace. Occasionally, she smiled, a rare, fleeting thing that spoke of hope amidst despair. When the final verse was transcribed, she leaned back, exhaustion mingling with pride. Her voice was soft but clear as she read aloud what she had written, the words carrying the weight of centuries, the hopes of scholars long gone, and the defiance of those who refused to let memory die. These words, she whispered, will live beyond the fire. I nodded, feeling a swell of emotion tightening my throat. In that moment, I saw not just a student, but a guardian, a flicker of the eternal flame that no conflagration could extinguish. Throughout the days that followed, Nerissa became a constant presence by my side. Together, we labored in the shadow of the gathering storm, copying verse after verse, weaving a tapestry of remembrance that might outlast the inevitable. Her youthful hands grew steadier, her understanding deeper, and her resolve firmer. Yet, with every scroll completed, the weight of what we faced pressed heavier upon us. The library's corridors, once alive with the hum of inquiry, now echoed with silence broken only by the distant murmur of unrest. The threat of fire loomed like a spectre, its heat already felt in the tightening of the city's nerves. One afternoon, as evening light spilled amber through the high windows, Nerissa and I sat by the open doorway, sharing a moment of quiet respite. The sky above Alexandria blazed with hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the darkening shadows that crept across the city. "Do you think the words will truly survive?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I smiled wanly, feeling the ache of uncertainty but also the stubborn flame of belief. "Words are more than marks on parchment," I replied. "They are the breath of thought, the pulse of memory. As long as there is one voice to speak them, they live." Her eyes shone with newfound resolve, and I knew that in her, the library's spirit endured a fragile but unyielding ember against the encroaching night. But even as hope blossomed in the quiet corners of our sanctuary, the world outside grew darker. Rumors of political strife and impending violence reached us through hurried whispers and furtive glances. The city's heart beat faster, its pulse erratic and fraught. One evening, as shadows lengthened and the scent of smoke wafted faintly on the breeze, Nerissa accidentally smudged a particularly delicate line in one of the scrolls. Her face paled, eyes wide with fear and self-reproach. "It is ruined," she murmured, voice trembling. I placed a steady hand over hers, my gaze soft but resolute. "Mistakes are part of the journey. We learn, we endure. The truth is in the striving, not in perfection." Her shoulders relaxed, and a small, grateful smile curled her lips. It was a moment of grace, amid the encroaching chaos, a reminder that the preservation of knowledge was as much an act of spirit as of ink and parchment. As night deepened, Nerissa read aloud the verses we had copied that day. Her voice wavered at first, uncertain and fragile, but gradually it grew stronger, resonating with the weight of our shared purpose. Each word was a testament, a beacon against the gathering darkness. From her lips, the poet's ink took flight, carrying the hopes, sorrows, and defiance of a civilization teetering on the brink. And in that fragile sound, I heard the promise of dawn, a fragile flame that no fire could consume. The days ahead would test us as never before. But for now, in the quiet glow of candlelight and shared resolve, the apprentice's ink spoke louder than the roar of distant flames. Together, we forged a fragile link between past and future, a fragile promise that the essence of human thought might endure even when all else was lost. And so, the scrolls multiplied silent witnesses to a world in flames, carried forward by trembling hands and steadfast hearts. The ink blurred the story of our times of loss and hope entwined, a testament to the enduring power of words. As I watched Nerissa grow into her role, I understood at last that the library's legacy was not confined to stone and scroll, but lived on in those who dared to remember, to write, and to believe. In her, the eternal flame flickered, still fragile, yes, but unyielding. And with that thought, I returned to my verses, the poet's task renewed and unbroken, even as the shadow of the coming fire stretched ever nearer. The corridors of the great library, once vibrant with the footsteps of scholars and the whispered debates of minds aflame with inquiry, now lay hushed beneath an oppressive stillness. I moved among the towering shelves, those ancient sentinels of humanity's collective wisdom, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the fading light. The air was thick with dust, disturbed only by the faintest stirrings of forgotten scrolls, their fragile edges curled and brittle. The silence was not a comfort. It pressed upon me like a shroud, heavy with the weight of absence. I paused beneath an archway where, only days before, learned voices had intertwined in passionate discourse. Now, only echoes answered. The murmurs of thought, the rustling of parchment, the scratch of reed pens all had fled, leaving behind a hollow shell. I traced my fingers lightly along the spines of scroll cases, feeling the uneven texture of vellum and papyrus, sensing the stories and knowledge enshrined within. Each scroll was a fragment of human endeavor, a testament to our ceaseless quest to understand the world and ourselves. Yet even as I revered these relics, a shadow crept upon my heart. What was the worth of such labor when the flames of human folly threatened to consume it all? The city beyond these walls churned with unrest. Political factions quarreled and plotted, indifferent to the treasures amassed here. The library had always been a beacon, a sanctuary where diverse beliefs could meet and collide peacefully in pursuit of truth. Now, that sanctuary lay vulnerable, its silence foretelling a calamity I dared not fully name. In a quiet alcove, I found the shattered remains of a scroll case. The once proud container lay broken, its precious contents strewn carelessly across the stone floor. Burnt edges curled like blackened leaves, the faint scent of smoke still lingering, a ghost of destruction already begun. I knelt among the fragments, heart tightening with each broken piece. These remnants whispered of knowledge lost, voices silenced forever. How many secrets, how many insights would vanish into oblivion? I rose and wandered further, drawn by a shaft of light that pierced the gloom through a high window. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunbeam, their slow dance a fragile ballet of light and shadow. For a moment, they seemed like tiny sparks, embers of the intellect, flickering defiantly in the encroaching darkness. It was a fragile hope, a reminder that even in silence, something endured. My thoughts were interrupted by the distant murmur of raised voices, the clamorous discord of the city leaking through the thick stone walls. The sounds were harsh, alien to the quiet dignity of these halls. Fear and anger clashed beyond, echoing the turmoil within my own soul. The political machinations that threatened the library's fate were relentless, indifferent to the sanctity of knowledge or the value of memory. I found myself longing for Callimachus, the ever-calm presence among the storm. His wisdom had often steadied me, his measured words a balm for rising despair. Though the halls were empty, I imagined his eyes behind those round spectacles, sharp and unyielding, probing the future as he had so many times before. I resolved to seek him out, to share the burden of this silent vigil, and to prepare for what was to come. Each step I took through the empty corridors deepened the ache within me, a mournful awareness of all that was at risk. Yet with that ache came a growing flame of resolve. The physical library might grow silent, its scrolls threatened by ruin, but the essence of its knowledge, the spirit captured in words and memory, could yet survive. It was this belief that compelled me to clutch my worn robes tightly and press onward, to commit verses in secret, to weave a tapestry of remembrance that no fire could wholly consume. As the shadows lengthened and the sun dipped low, the silent corridors whispered their fragile truths. They spoke of impermanence, of loss, but also of endurance. In the quiet, I heard the pulse of a promise that though the voices might fall silent, the power of words would persist, luminous and unyielding, like faint stars against the gathering night. And so I walked on, a solitary witness to the fading grandeur, a poet bound to memory and hope, determined to give voice to what must not be forgotten. The city outside might tremble, divided and uncertain, but here in the stillness I found a solemn purpose. The library's silence was not surrender. It was a prelude, an aching breath held before the storm, a moment for the intellect to rally and resist. Tomorrow, perhaps, the flames would come. But tonight, in these silent corridors, the poet's heart beat steady, and the words, fragile yet fierce, waited to be born. The silence would not last forever. Neither would the story, and I would be its keeper. The acrid scent of smoke crept insidiously through the labyrinthine corridors of the great library, first a whisper, then a roar. I was seated near the eastern wing, where the scrolls on astronomy and philosophy were kept, when the faint flicker of orange light caught my eye. At first, I thought it a trick of my wary mind, but as the shadows writhed and the smell of burning parchment grew stronger, the truth struck me with the force of a gale. The library was aflame. Chaos erupted like the thunderous cracking of a great tree splitting. Voices shouted, some in alarm, others in frantic confusion, echoing off the stone walls that had stood witness to centuries of human thought. The air grew thick with smoke, a choking haze that blurred the outlines of the grand columns and the endless rows of shelves. I coughed, my throat burning, but my mind rallied with an urgency unlike any I had known. From the depths of the turmoil, a steady hand grasped my arm. It was Celine, her eyes fierce with determination, her grip firm as iron. We must move, she urged, her voice cutting through the din. There is no time to lose. Together, we navigated the labyrinth, the heat pressing in like a living thing. The roar of the fire was a monstrous chorus, punctuated by the crashing of timber and the desperate cries of those caught unawares. Celine's steady presence was a beacon amid the madness, guiding me past fallen debris and smoke-choked passages towards safer ground. Yet even as danger encroached, my hands trembled not with fear but with the compulsion to write. I found a small alcove, shielded somewhat from the worst of the inferno. Kneeling, I unrolled a fragile scroll, its surface already smudged with ash. The candle I carried flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters on the walls. With calloused fingers, I dipped the quill into ink and began to etch my verses, each word a defiant flame against the consuming darkness. Around me, the library groaned and cracked, the sound of splintering wood and collapsing stone a grim symphony. Sparks drifted down like malevolent snowflakes, settling on parchment and stone alike. My heart pounded in rhythm with the destruction. Each line I wrote a desperate plea to eternity. Suddenly, a violent crash shattered the fragile quiet. The ceiling above us buckled, sending a shower of embers and dust. Celine sprang forward, positioning herself between me and the falling debris. "Stay behind me," she commanded, her voice low but resolute. Together, we dodged the blaze's hungry grasp, the heat searing our skin through thin robes. In moments like these, I understood the cruel paradox of fire. It was both destroyer and purifier, consuming all in its path yet leaving behind only the essence of what had been. The scrolls, the tomes, the endless knowledge, they might perish in flame. But the words I wrote could live on, carried in memory and verse. The fire pressed onward, relentless and unyielding, but with Celine's aid, and my verses as my shield, I pressed deeper into the heart of the library's blaze. Each step was a battle, each breath a victory over despair. The flames might devour the scrolls, but they could not silence the poet's voice. As the blaze illuminated the ancient walls in grotesque hues of red and gold, I vowed silently that no matter the cost, the wisdom of Alexandria would not perish without a fight. The fire might rage, the smoke might choke, and the walls might crumble, but the words would endure, whispered on the wind, carried in hearts, eternal as the stars. And so, beneath the burning heavens of our fallen city, I wrote, with smoke in my lungs and fire in my soul, I began the verses that would outlast the flames. The great library might be dying, but the poet's song had just begun. Beyond the immediate horror, the fire's first crackling moments were a crucible for resolve. The poet's hand, though trembling, was steadied by the fierce determination that knowledge must not be lost to the merciless blaze. Celine's presence was not merely protective, but emblematic of the alliance between thought and action, intellect and courage. Together, they embodied a fragile hope amid devastation. The air was thick with smoke, a choking haze that clawed at my throat and blurred the edges of the world I had known all my life. Flames licked hungrily at the ancient stones, their orange tongues casting turbulent shadows that danced wildly against the once pristine walls of the great library. Amidst this inferno, I sat cross-legged on the cold marble floor, a solitary figure against the encroaching devastation, my quill scratching tirelessly upon fragile parchment. Each stroke was a defiant whisper against the roaring chaos, a desperate attempt to wrest meaning from the madness that consumed us. The heat pressed heavy against my skin, a suffocating weight that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Yet my hands moved with a fevered urgency, guided by a resolve that refused to yield. The words poured forth, verses born from the marrow of sorrow and hope that sought to capture not just the knowledge that surrounded us, but the very essence of human endurance. The library, with its labyrinthine corridors and towering shelves, was a vessel of collective memory, a testament to centuries of human inquiry and imagination. Now it was a crucible, testing the mettle of those who dared to preserve its soul. Outside the chamber, the cacophony of destruction was relentless. The crackle of burning scrolls, the crash of collapsing beams, and the anguished cries of those caught in the turmoil formed a dreadful symphony. But within this sanctuary of crumbling stone, my world narrowed to the parchment before me, the ink dark and fluid beneath my trembling fingers. Suddenly, the heavy door burst open, and Celine entered with the force of a tempest. Her eyes, sharp and blazing with determination, scanned the room before settling on me. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her face flushed with exertion and fear. "We have no time," she said, her voice low but resolute. "Others seek to seize what remains, some driven by desperation, others by greed. They care little for knowledge. They want power." I looked up, the weight of her words settling over me. The fire outside was not the only threat. Human folly fanned the flames of destruction just as fiercely. "Then we must be faster," I whispered, returning my gaze to the parchment. "Words can outlast these flames, if only we can write them down in time." Celine nodded, moving to stand guard by the door, her presence a shield against the encroaching chaos. The alliance between her fierce strength and my fragile verses was an unlikely one, yet it was born of necessity and shared purpose. As I wrote, Callimachus appeared, leaning heavily on his staff, his white beard streaked with ash. His eyes, though tired, held a steady light. He gestured toward a concealed alcove, a hidden repository known only to a few. "There is still hope," he murmured. Beneath the rubble lie texts untouched by flame. "We must save them." Together, we moved through the dim corridors, the flickering firelight casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us like specters. The air was thick with dust and despair, but also an unspoken promise, a vow to salvage what we could, no matter the cost. In the alcove, ancient scrolls lay buried beneath layers of dust and broken stone. Each was a fragile fragment of human thought, a whisper from the past resisting oblivion. I gathered what I could, pressing them close as if their very touch could stave off the fire's hunger. Back in the chamber, the smoke grew thicker, curling around me like a dark shroud. Yet my voice rose in whispered verses, a litany against despair. Each word was a spark, a flicker of light in the gathering darkness, a fragile shield woven from ink and breath. The fire's roar was deafening now, and the walls trembled with the library's final agony. But I wrote on, driven by a conviction that words could transcend the physical, that the flame of intellect could not be extinguished by mere destruction. Celine's sharp commands kept the chaos at bay, her presence a bulwark of safety amid the storm. Callimachus' wisdom guided us to hidden caches, each discovery a small victory against the inevitable. Hours passed, or perhaps it was moments. Time had lost meaning in the inferno. My body ached, my lungs burned, but within me burned a fiercer flame, the unyielding belief that knowledge, though battered and scarred, would endure. As the first light of dawn threatened the horizon, the fire's fury began to wane, leaving behind a smoldering ruin. The library's grand halls were no more, but in my hands lay verses that bore the promise of remembrance and resistance. I looked up, eyes meeting Celine's and Callimachus, and saw reflected the same wary hope that had carried us through the night. The library was gone, but its spirit lived on not in stone or scroll, but in the words we forged amidst the blaze. And so, amidst ashes and ruin, I vowed to carry this fragile flame forward, a beacon for those who would come after. For though fire may consume, it cannot claim the immortal fire of human thought. The battle was far from over, but in the quiet moments between destruction and dawn, I found a truth that no flame could ever burn away, that words, once spoken or written, possess a power beyond the reach of any blaze. The crackling roar of the fire was no longer distant, it had become a living beast, devouring the grand edifice that had stood as a sanctuary for centuries. Smoke curled through the air, thick and acrid, stinging my eyes as I followed Callimachus through the twisting labyrinth beneath the great library. His aged frame moved with surprising agility, guided by decades of intimate knowledge of these hidden corridors. This way, he whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos above. There are storerooms few know of, vaults, where the rarest manuscripts, those too precious or fragile for the open halls, have been concealed. I clutched my scrolls tighter, the parchment crinkling beneath my trembling fingers. Each word I had penned was a fragile ember against the encroaching blaze, a testament to what I refused to let die. Yet, even as I clung to my verses, I knew that the physical scrolls, the tangible vessels of knowledge, were equally vital. The narrow passageways smelled of damp stone and ancient dust. Above us, the library's grand chambers echoed with distant crashes and the intermittent roar of flames claiming their prey. The flickering light from Callimachus's oil lamp cast tall, trembling shadows that danced on the walls, and every step felt weighted with the gravity of our task. The politicians care little for what is lost, Callimachus murmured as we paused before a heavy oaken door concealed behind a tapestry. His eyes, sharp even beneath bushy white brows, met mine. But we, those who understand the value of these words, must bear the burden of their preservation. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The library was more than stone and scrolls, it was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, the fragile thread linking past to future. If that thread snapped, all would be lost. With a creak, Callimachus pushed open the door, revealing a dim chamber lined with shelves, crammed with scrolls and codices wrapped carefully in cloth. Some bore the marks of age and neglect, while others gleamed as if freshly inscribed. "Here lies the essence of Alexandria's soul," he said softly. "Philosophy, medicine, astronomy, knowledge that no flame should claim." I stepped inside reverently, my eyes scanning the treasures as I carefully selected scrolls, feeling the fragile weight of each. The edges of some were singed, a cruel reminder of the fire's reach, yet their contents remained intact. Suddenly, a distant crash made us both freeze. Dust and small debris rained from the ceiling as the building trembled. "We must be swift," Callimachus urged. "The structure weakens." Outside, the muffled shouts of Celine reached us, her protective presence a steady reassurance amid the chaos. Through a narrow window, I glimpsed her silhouette, vigilant and poised, a guardian of both people and knowledge. With trembling hands, I unfurled one scroll, its delicate script etched by a hand long gone. Words flowed like a river of light against the darkness threatening to consume us. I began to write, feverish and desperate, capturing the essence of what we could not carry with us, the spirit of a library ablaze yet unbroken in memory. The hours slipped by in a blur of urgency and aching reverence. Each moment was a dance on the edge of oblivion, a test of resolve and faith. Callimachus's wisdom guided me, Selene's strength shielded me, and my verses became a fragile bulwark against despair. As the fire's fury grew, so too did my conviction. Though the walls around us crumbled and the smoke thickened, the words I committed to parchment promised a defiance that even the fiercest blaze could not extinguish. At last, with a final glance at the hidden trove, I understood that our mission was only beginning. The knowledge we saved was a seed, fragile yet potent, destined to be carried forward by those willing to remember and to resist the erasure of time. "Come," Callimachus said, urgency sharpening his voice. "There is no time to linger. The flames hunger for all, but we shall be their greatest adversaries." With the precious scrolls secured, and the poet's verses burning bright within my heart, we prepared to face the inferno once more, undaunted, unbroken, and resolute. The night was far from over, and the story of Alexandria's great library was still being written, not in stone or scroll, but in the enduring light of human spirit and memory. The air inside the great library had thickened beyond the usual weight of dust and parchment. Now it bore the acrid sting of smoke and the sharp tang of fear. The once vibrant halls, lined with scrolls and tomes from every corner of the known world, echoed with a cacophony of chaos shouts, the clash of weapons, and the frantic rustling of fleeing feet. My hands trembled as I pressed palm to parchment, inscribing verses born from the very heart of this crumbling sanctuary. Each word was a desperate thread, weaving a fragile tapestry against the encroaching darkness. I had sought refuge in a shadowed alcove, pressed tight against the cold stone wall. The flickering light of distant flames cast elongated, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the sanctity of this place. Around me, the library's vast collection lay in peril. The ink on countless scrolls threatened to run with the heat, the brittle papyrus ready to turn to ash. Yet I wrote, for I believed in the power of words to outlive even the fiercest blaze. Suddenly, the hurried footfalls of more than one pursuer shattered the fragile quiet. The metallic glint of swords caught the light, as a ragged band of looters, driven by desperation, and the breakdown of order stormed into the corridor. Their eyes wild, they sought not knowledge but plunder, eager to seize any treasure amid the ruin. My heart pounded, not from fear of death, but from the thought of losing what little I could still save. A voice cut through the turmoil, a fierce, commanding presence that shifted the tide. Selene burst into the alcove, breath ragged but eyes ablaze with determination. Her athletic form was a stark contrast to the scholarly quiet I embodied. Where I was fragile and contemplative, she was force incarnate. Without hesitation, she brandished her sword, stepping between me and the advancing threat. "Back!" she shouted, voice sharp as the blade she wielded. The looters faltered, momentarily stunned by the sudden defense. Selene's stance was unyielding, a shield forged from resolve and purpose. In that moment, the library's walls seemed to hold their breath, as if the very stones recognized the significance of this confrontation. The clash was swift and brutal. Shelves toppled, sending cascades of scrolls fluttering like wounded birds. The scent of burnt papyrus mingled with the coppery tang of blood as Selene parried and struck, her movements a blur of practiced precision. I could only clutch my precious scrolls tighter, the verses within now more vital than ever. Amid the melee, Selene's voice rose above the chaos, rallying a sudden surge of city guards who had rallied in defense of their heritage. Together, they pushed back the marauders, restoring a fragile semblance of order. When the dust settled, Selene extended a steadying hand, her eyes locked onto mine. "We must move quickly," she urged, voice low but urgent. "There is still much to save." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. With Celine's strength bolstering my resolve, I rose to my feet. The scrolls, delicate and precious, were now entrusted not only to my hands, but to the fierce protection of a warrior who understood that knowledge and survival were intertwined. As we slipped deeper into the labyrinth of fire and shadow, the alliance between us crystallized a union of intellect and action, poetry and steel. I knew then that the preservation of memory required more than verses. It demanded courage, defiance, and an unbreakable shield against the flames of destruction. The flames outside roared like a beast untamed, but within me a different fire burned, a fierce hope that the words I penned, guarded by Celine's unwavering shield, might endure beyond the ruin. In this crucible of loss and resistance, I found my purpose anew, to be the voice of a library dying, and the herald of a legacy that would rise from ashes yet to come. As we moved forward, the shadows lengthened, and the fire's hunger grew. But so too did my determination, fueled by Celine's fierce protection and the unyielding power of the written word. Together, we would face the night, guarding the fragile ember of knowledge against the consuming dark. And thus, amid the ruin and roar, the poet and the warrior became one, each a vital thread in the tapestry of resistance woven beneath the ever-watchful gaze of the burning library. The air was thick with smoke, a choking veil that blurred the once majestic outlines of the great library. Its walls, which had held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, now groaned beneath the relentless assault of fire. I sat on a cracked stone bench, my hands trembling as the acrid scent of burnt parchment clung to my skin and filled my lungs. Around me, the ruin whispered of knowledge lost, voices silenced beneath the weight of flame. I dared not close my eyes, for in the flickering shadows cast by the dying embers, I saw the faces of those who had walked these halls before me, the scholars, the scribes, the seekers of truth. Their dreams, their painstaking labors, now consumed in a blaze that seemed to mock the fragile endurance of words. Yet, in the depths of my despair, a stubborn ember glowed within me. The verses I had penned, hastily scrawled on secret scrolls hidden from the inferno, took shape in my mind. Each line a defiance, a testament that though the flesh of books might perish, the spirit of their meaning could endure. The fire might claim the scrolls and tomes, but never the essence of the thoughts they carried. Callimachus approached, his steps slow and measured, the weight of years visible in the stoop of his frame and the tremor in his voice. His once sharp eyes, framed by round spectacles, gazed upon the ruin with a sorrow that was almost sacred. The library, he breathed, all that we devoted our lives to, reduced to ashes. Yet, these flames cannot consume what dwells in memory and in the hearts of those who bear witness. His words were a balm, a fragile hope amid the desolation. I looked to him and saw not defeat, but the quiet resolve of one who understood that loss was not the end, but a crucible through which true knowledge passes. Celine stood nearby, her athletic silhouette a stark contrast to the crumbling backdrop. Her dark eyes burned with an unyielding fire, mirroring the flames that threatened to devour us all. She was a guardian, not just of the city's walls, but of its soul. Without a word, her presence was a promise, a vow that whatever remained, whatever could be saved, would not be surrendered lightly. I unfurled a fresh scroll, the parchment whispering beneath my fingers. The ink was still wet as I wrote, each stroke a lifeline thrown into the abyss of loss. My verses wove together the anguish of destruction with the fragile tendrils of hope. They spoke of the impermanence of stone and paper, but also of the immortality of ideas, of stories, memories, and truths that no flame could erase. The cacophony of crackling wood and collapsing shelves was a grim chorus to my writing, yet within it, I found a rhythm that steadied my breath and sharpened my focus. The library was dying, but I was its voice in the darkness. "Why do you persist?" Callimachus asked softly, his gaze fixed on the smoke-choked sky. "Because if I do not, I replied. Then who will remember what was lost? Who will carry the flame when these ashes cool? His nod was slow, a silent affirmation that the burden we bore was one of memory as much as survival. Outside, Celine's vigilant watch kept the encroaching chaos at bay. She moved with purpose, her resolve a shield against despair. I knew that without her, my fragile scrolls would be no more than charred remnants scattered to the wind. As the night deepened, the fire's roar softened to a mournful crackle. Exhausted, I paused my writing and let the silence seep into my bones. The weight of loss pressed upon me like a stone, yet beneath it, a flicker of something enduring hope. The hope that words, once breathed into existence, take on a life beyond the flesh of their carriers. In that moment, I understood the sacredness of my task. Not merely to record what was being destroyed, but to transmute grief into defiance, loss into legacy. The library's physical form would not endure, but its spirit, carried on by those who dared to remember and speak, might yet kindle a fire that no destruction could quench. I dipped my quill into the ink once more, the scratch of its tip on parchment a solemn hymn. Though the flames consume the scrolls I wrote, the fire of thought burns eternal. And with those words, I sealed my vow. The library might fall, but I would carry its light into the shadows, a beacon for those yet to come. For in the end, knowledge is not bound by walls or scrolls, it lives in the hearts of those who remember. Night surrendered slowly to dawn, the smoke thinning to reveal a sky bruised with the promise of a new day. The fire had left devastation in its wake, but amid the rubble, a fragile hope stirred, one that I vowed to nurture with every breath and every verse. The weight of loss was immense, yet heavier still was the responsibility of memory. And so, I wrote on, my words a fragile shield against the darkness, a testament that even in ruin, the human spirit endures. The evening air was heavy with the scent of burning wood and wet stone, faint wisps of smoke curling through the cracked window panes of the chamber where Nerissa worked. Candlelight flickered against the rough-hewn walls, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Her slender fingers trembled slightly as she held the reed pen, dipping it into the ink with careful precision. Each stroke was deliberate, each curve of a letter a small act of defiance against the relentless tide consuming their world. Beside her, the poet watched with a quiet intensity, his eyes, deep-set and shadowed from sleepless nights, softened as he observed the young apprentice's growing confidence. Steady, he murmured, voice laced with both encouragement and the weight of urgency. Remember, these words are more than ink on parchment. They are the flame that must not be allowed to die. Nerissa nodded, swallowing the lump that rose in her throat. The responsibility pressed upon her like a tangible weight, heavy yet strangely invigorating. The verses she copied were no mere poems. They were fragments of a world slipping inexorably into shadow. Each line carried the wisdom of scholars long gone, the dreams of a city built on knowledge, and the fragile hope that even as the flames devoured the physical, the essence could endure. Outside, the distant roar of the city's unrest seeped into the small room. The muffled clamor of hurried footsteps, the crackle of flames licking closer, and the low murmur of frightened voices provided a grim soundtrack to their work. Yet within this fragile sanctuary, time seemed to slow, focusing all energy on the delicate task before them. The world may forget the scrolls, the poet said softly, but it must not forget the words. Nerissa's gaze lifted from the script, meeting his. In her wide eyes flickered the mingling of fear and resolve. "I will remember," she whispered, the promise catching in her breath. As the hours waned, fatigue settled into her bones. The ink-stained parchment grew in neat piles beside her, each scroll a testament to perseverance. Yet, despite weariness, Nerissa's movements grew surer, her copying more fluid. The initial hesitation that had marked her first attempts melted into a steady rhythm, a quiet rebellion against the destruction raging beyond the walls. The poet leaned back, exhaustion pinching the lines of his face. "You have become more than an apprentice," he declared, voice thick with emotion. You are the keeper now." A faint smile touched her lips, fragile but genuine. The mantle was heavy, yet it was a mantle she was ready to bear. In that moment, a fragile thread of hope wove itself through the encroaching darkness. The night deepened, and with it, the poet's verses found new life in Nerissa's careful hands. Outside, the city trembled under the weight of its fate, but within the chamber, a small flame of continuity burned bright. The promise of knowledge, of memory, and of resilience lived on not in the ash and ruin, but in the unyielding spirit of those who refused to let words perish. As Nerissa rolled the final scroll and tied it with a thread, her heart thrummed with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and loss, but the legacy they carried was a beacon in the gathering night. The poet stood, stretching cramped limbs, eyes fixed on the fragile bundle in Nerissa's hands. "Tomorrow," he said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath, "we must find a way to carry these safely beyond the flames." She nodded, understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. "I will not fail you." As the candle guttered low and shadows deepened, Nerissa's promise echoed silently through the chamber, a vow that the intellectual fire, though battered, would endure beyond the ruin. The poet's verses, once fragile whispers in the shadow of destruction, now found a steadfast guardian in the young scribe. The story of Alexandria's greatest library, though scarred by flame, was far from finished. And in that fragile vow lay the true heart of resistance, not in stone or scrolls, but in the unyielding will to remember and to hope. The night held its breath, waiting for the dawn, and with it, the next chapter in the story of survival. The acrid scent of smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the dust of crumbling stone and scattered parchment. The city of Alexandria, that ancient jewel of learning and culture, was now a labyrinth of ruin and despair. Yet amid this chaos, a quiet determination stirred in the narrow alleyways where the merchant moved with practiced stealth. His cart, modest and unassuming, was laden with the weight of centuries' scrolls, fragile and precious, each one a fragment of a vast mosaic of human thought. The merchant's hands were steady, though his eyes betrayed the tension that gripped him. Every creak of wood, every distant cry, was a reminder that time was slipping away with the smoke and flame. The poet watched him from the shadows near the ruined library steps, his heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The merchant was a man of pragmatism, a stark contrast to the poet's idealism, yet both were bound by a common cause: to preserve what they could of a world unraveling before their eyes. "Are the scrolls secure?" the poet asked quietly as the merchant finished stowing the last bundle. For now the merchant replied, his voice low but firm. "But the road ahead is perilous. The city is no longer safe, and there are eyes everywhere, some looking to seize, others indifferent to the loss." Celine emerged from the shadows, her presence a reassuring anchor amid the tempest. Her sharp gaze swept the surroundings, vigilant as ever. "We must move swiftly," she urged. "The longer we linger, the greater the risk." Together, the trio set out, threading through the labyrinthine streets where the destruction was most severe. Flames still licked at the edges of the library's outer walls, casting a flickering orange glow that danced against the night. The crackling roar was punctuated by the distant shouts of frightened citizens and the heavy footsteps of soldiers enforcing curfews. The merchant's intimate knowledge of Alexandria's back alleys and hidden paths was their greatest asset. He guided Celine and the poet on a circuitous route designed to avoid the main thoroughfares, where chaos and danger were at their peak. Each step was measured, every sound analyzed for threats. As they moved, the poet's mind raced. He thought of the countless scholars who had passed through these streets, and halls, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge. Now much of that knowledge was reduced to ash. Yet in his heart he clung to the belief that words, once spoken or written, bore a resilience beyond the physical. The merchant's cart jolted over uneven cobblestones, the precious cargo trembling with each bump. Careful, Celine cautioned, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword, ready for any sudden peril. We cannot afford to lose anything now. Hours passed like this, a tense dance between hope and despair. At one point, they paused beneath the shadow of a crumbling archway, catching their breath and listening intently. The night was filled with the symphony of destruction, the crackle of fire, the distant crash of falling masonry, the murmurs of frightened voices. The city mourns, the poet whispered, but it must not forget. The merchant nodded, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool night air. It is why I do this, not for glory, but for the future. These scrolls are more than paper and ink. They are the memory of a people, a testament to our shared humanity. Celine's eyes softened briefly, her usual resolve touched by the weight of their mission. Then we must ensure they live beyond these walls. Finally, as dawn's first light began to pale the dark sky, they approached the city's edge. The air shifted, cooler and freer, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. The merchant's breathing grew steadier, relief washing over his features as the gates loomed ahead, still standing, still guarding a fragile hope. Carefully, the cart slipped through the guards' watchful eyes, aided by Celine's authority and the merchant's quick thinking. Beyond the gates, the world seemed quieter, the devastation of the city momentarily held at bay. The poet stepped forward, touching the bundles wrapped in cloth, his fingers tracing the outlines of the scrolls within. These words, these fragments of our past, they will endure, he said, voice firm with conviction. Not just in memory, but in these scrolls, in the hearts of those who carry them forward. The merchant exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For now they are safe, but the journey is far from over. Celine sheathed her sword, her gaze distant but resolute. Then we must prepare for what comes next. The survival of knowledge depends on more than just escape. It requires guardianship and sacrifice. As the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon, the three stood united, bearers of a flame that, though battered and bruised, refused to be extinguished. The city behind them smoldered, but the future held a fragile promise. The merchant's flight was more than a simple act of survival. It was a defiant stand against oblivion, a vital link in the chain that would carry Alexandria's legacy beyond the ashes. And as the poet prepared to continue his verses in exile, he knew that both tangible and intangible treasures must endure for the hope of rebirth. Yet, amid the fragile calm, a question lingered in the poet's mind like a whispered echo. How long could words and scrolls withstand the tides of time and turmoil? The answer, he hoped, lay not in certainty but in relentless faith. I sat in the shadowed alcove of the library's western wing, the air thick with the scent of smoke and the bitter tang of ash. Around me, the once proud shelves stood scarred and empty, their treasures either lost to flame or hastily concealed. My quill hovered above the fragile parchment, fingers trembling not from cold but from a weariness that burrowed deep within my bones. The weight of loss pressed upon me. The knowledge of countless minds, the dreams of centuries, seemed to flicker like a dying candle before the inexorable darkness. The fire had come and gone, leaving behind ruin and silence where once there was the vibrant hum of discovery. I had borne witness to the collapse, each crackle of burning papyrus a nail in the coffin of our collective intellect. Yet, as the smoke cleared, I found myself confronted not only with the external devastation, but with the tempest within. Doubt gnawed at my resolve. Could words, mere symbols on parchment, truly outlast the ravages of flame and time? Was my labor a futile act of defiance against the inevitable? I lowered my quill, rubbing my weary eyes beneath lids swollen from sleepless nights. The brittle parchment before me seemed to mock my hesitation, its surface fragile as the memories it sought to preserve. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that to despair was to surrender, that the essence of thought, once set free by the ink, might yet transcend the physicality of its vessel. It was then that a quiet presence entered the alcove. Celine, her footsteps, steady and sure despite the ruin around us, brought with them an unspoken promise of endurance. She approached with measured grace, her dark eyes meeting mine with a familiarity born of shared struggle. Placing a firm hand upon my shoulder, she offered a smile rare and brief but luminous against the gloom. "We endure," she said simply, voice low but resolute. "Words are more than ink and scrolls. They are the fire that no flame can consume." Her conviction rekindled a spark within me. I felt the weight upon my shoulders shift, no longer a crushing burden, but a mantle of responsibility I was determined to bear. The fragility of my body mattered less than the strength of my spirit, and with renewed purpose, I dipped my quill once more into the ink. Hours later, Nerissa appeared, clutching a freshly copied scroll. Her fingers were stained with ink, and her youthful face bore traces of fatigue, yet her eyes shone with a fierce determination that belied her years. She unrolled the parchment carefully and began to read aloud. Her voice, at first tentative, grew steadier with each line, weaving the poet's verses into the heavy air, a fragile melody of memory and hope amidst the desolation. I listened, heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. Here was the future, embodied in a young apprentice who embraced the daunting task of preservation. The words were not merely surviving. They were living, breathing, carrying with them the indomitable will of those who refused to let the light of knowledge be extinguished. As Nerissa's voice faded, I rose and moved toward a shattered window overlooking the city's smoldering skyline. The horizon was a tapestry of smoke and embers, a testament to human folly and loss. Yet beneath the ruin, I sensed a pulse, a stubborn heartbeat of resilience. I inhaled deeply, the acrid air filling my lungs, and vowed silently that as long as breath remained within me, I would be the keeper of this flame. The physical library might have fallen, but the intellectual fire it kindled would burn eternal, carried forth on the wings of words and memory. Tonight, I am no longer merely a witness to destruction. I am a guardian of legacy, a poet who stands defiantly against oblivion. And in this resolve, I find my strength renewed, ready to face whatever trials the dawn may bring. The quill moved steadily across the parchment, each stroke a defiant heartbeat against the silent void. In the depths of despair, I found a wellspring of hope, and with it the promise that knowledge, like fire, can never be fully tamed or truly lost. But the night is long, and the shadows deepen. Yet even as darkness gathers, my verses will blaze onward, a testament to all that was, and all that might yet be. I must write, I must endure, for in words we live beyond the flame. The night had folded around Alexandria like a shroud, but its darkness was pierced by a terrible light. From my vantage on the balcony above the central courtyard, I watched the great library surrender itself to the flames. The fire was not merely a blaze. It was a ravenous creature, consuming all with an insatiable hunger that defied reason. Walls, scrolls, and dreams all succumbed beneath its relentless advance. The roar of the inferno filled the air, a chorus of destruction that drowned out the cries of men, and the whispered laments of knowledge slipping beyond reach. Beneath the fiery canopy, the shadows danced with cruel whimsy. The flames licked at the sky as though to claim the heavens themselves, their tongues flickering with mocking grace. I felt a peculiar awe amid the despair, how the very thing that destroyed could also purify, how fire's dual nature was as ancient as time. It reminded me of the hobris that had built this city, and its great repository of wisdom, a human ambition reaching too far, daring to capture the sum of all knowledge in fragile scrolls and brittle tomes. Yet, as the fire consumed, it also unveiled a truth nothing mortal could endure untouched. Inside the inner sanctum, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning parchment. Callimachus and I moved quickly, our hands trembling as we gathered what fragile scrolls we could reach. The ember-strewn air stung our eyes and choked our breaths, but still we dared to hope. Each scroll we saved felt like a small victory, a whispered defiance against the inferno's claim. Callimachus's eyes, sharp behind his round spectacles, mirrored my own sorrow and determination. Together, We were guardians of a legacy that now seemed as fragile as the ash swirling around us. Outside, Celine's presence was a blistering flame of its own. As the city's guard, she stood between the chaos and the dwindling remnants of knowledge. A desperate mob surged toward the library's gates, hands grasping for any remnant of the scrolls and tomes now beyond their reach. Celine met them with fierce resolve, her athletic form illuminated by the fiery glow, eyes blazing with unyielding spirit. Her voice rang out, both command and plea, a shield forged not just of steel but of unbreakable will. In her, I saw the embodiment of the city's struggle, a delicate balance of destruction and defense. Retreating to a hidden alcove, I found solace in the quiet hum of a single candle. The pale light flickered against the walls, shadows stretched and shrank like living things, mirroring the chaos beyond. Here, I wrote with fevered urgency, my fingers stained with ink and trembling from exhaustion. Each verse was a battle cry, a tether to a future unseen but fiercely hoped for. I wrestled with the paradox that gnawed at my heart. The physical knowledge, the scrolls and tomes, would perish in the flames, yet perhaps the essence, the ideas. The words could rise anew, immortal in memory and ink. The fire's hunger was total, its destruction absolute, but I clung to the fragile hope that the written word might transcend the blaze. The flames could devour parchment and wood, but they could not consume the spirit that crafted the verses, nor the human will to remember and pass on what had been lost. In the heart of destruction, I found a stubborn ember of resilience, a promise that even as the great library crumbled to ash, the intellectual fire it kindled would endure. Carried in the verses I now penned with trembling hands. The night stretched on, a battleground between flame and memory, between loss and hope. As the fire painted the sky with strokes of orange and black, I whispered a vow to the dying light that I would be the keeper of this last intellectual flame, that words would outlive the fire, and that from the ashes, some fragment of our collective wisdom would rise again. The flames may hunger to erase, but they would never silence the eternal fire of human thought. And as the first embers fell like tears into the dark streets below, I felt the weight of human hubris and the fragile promise of resilience entwined. A testament to the enduring power of words in a world consumed by flame. The night was far from over, and the story of fire and memory was yet to be fully told. The air hung heavy with smoke, a relentless pall that dulled the sun's feeble attempt to pierce the grey veil above Alexandria. Among the crumbled stones and smouldering embers of the great library, I knelt on the cold earth, fingers trembling as I sifted carefully through the scattered remains. Charred fragments of parchment lay scattered like fallen leaves, their edges brittle, their inscriptions faint yet stubbornly enduring beneath the ash. Each piece was a shard of a world once whole: wisdom, poetry, philosophy, and the accumulated knowledge of countless generations, now reduced to fragile whispers of ink and fire. My breath came in ragged gasps, the acrid smoke clawing at my throat, yet I dared not stop. Every fragment might be all that remained, a fragile ember of light amid the overwhelming darkness. I traced the furrowed lines of a burned verse, the words faint but legible enough to stir a flicker of defiance within me. Here, in these fragments, lay the promise that knowledge could outlast even the fiercest blaze. The fire had claimed the walls and scrolls, but it had not yet claimed the words themselves. Callimachus appeared beside me, leaning heavily on his staff. His white beard was streaked with soot, his spectacles askew, but the sharpness in his eyes burned still. He regarded the scattered fragments with a grave solemnity, then allowed a faint nod. "These pieces," he murmured, "are all that remain, yet they are a beginning, small fragments of light in a vast darkness. We must carry them forward." His words, though quiet, struck a chord deep within me. The weight of loss was immense, yet the responsibility to preserve what little survived was heavier still. We gathered the fragments with utmost care, wrapping them in cloth to shield them from the lingering heat and the ever-present threat of rain or further ruin. Nearby, Celine stood sentinel at the ruined library's entrance, her silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. Her eyes scanned the horizon with fierce resolve, the firelight reflecting in their depths like twin stars refusing to be extinguished. Her presence was a shield not only for our fragile cargo, but for the fragile hope that still flickered within us. Inside the shattered halls, Nerissa sat cross-legged on a stone bench, her youthful face illuminated by the flickering glow of a small oil lamp. Ink-stained fingers moved deftly across clean parchment, copying the salvaged verses with a reverence that belied her years. I watched her for a moment, a symbol of renewal amid destruction, an apprentice carrying the torch of knowledge forward into the uncertain night. As dusk settled, a familiar figure approached through the haze, the merchant, his weathered hands clutching a small bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. He offered it to me without a word, a simple gesture laden with unspoken understanding. Inside, I found fresh parchment and ink, untouched by fire and ruin. The gift was a lifeline, a reaffirmation that even in the darkest hours, human solidarity could kindle renewal. I unwrapped the bundle with care, the smooth sheets promising new beginnings. The ink, rich and black, awaited the stroke of my pen. I felt a swell of gratitude and determination rise within me. The fire had taken much, but it had not yet taken the spirit that fueled these words, the intellectual fire that burns eternal even as the physical world crumbles. Together we set to work. Nerissa's pen danced across the fresh parchment, transcribing the fragments I recited from memory. Callimachus offered guidance, recalling passages lost to the flames but preserved within the minds of survivors. Celine's watchful gaze ensured our fragile endeavor was not interrupted by chaos or threat. And I, the poet, wove these scattered threads into verses that sought to capture the essence of what had been and what might yet endure. The night deepened. Within the small circle of light and ink, a fragile hope blossomed. Each word written was an act of defiance, a beacon against oblivion. These fragments of knowledge, though broken and scorched, were more than relics. They were the seeds from which future understanding might grow. Yet even as we worked, the weight of loss pressed upon us. The silence of the once vibrant halls was a haunting echo, a reminder of the impermanence of human endeavors. The flames had been merciless, but in their wake, a new fire kindled, a fire of memory, storytelling, and the unyielding belief that words outlive stone and ash. I paused often, listening to the crackle of dying embers and the faint rustle of parchment, the sounds a solemn symphony of endings and beginnings. The verses I composed were both elegy and promise, mourning what was lost yet embracing what might endure. As dawn approached, the first pale light filtered through the smoky skies, casting long shadows over the ruined library. We gathered the newly copied scrolls, their edges clean and unblemished, and wrapped them carefully for the journey ahead. The path was uncertain, fraught with peril and sorrow, but these fragments of light would accompany us, a testament to resilience and the eternal flame of human thought. And so, as the city stirred beneath the burden of loss, I understood that though the great library had fallen, its spirit lived on within us. In every word preserved, every story told, the intellectual fire endured an unquenchable blaze that no destruction could ever fully silence. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but with these fragments of light, we carried a fragile hope that the essence of human knowledge and memory could be reborn from ashes, whispered on the winds of time, and inscribed forever in the hearts of those who dared to remember. The flames may have consumed the walls, but they could not consume the words. And as long as words remain, so too does the promise of dawn. The once vibrant halls of the great library now lay draped in a shroud of silence that felt almost sacred in its weight. My footsteps echoed softly against the blackened stone, a hollow sound that marked the absence of the relentless curiosity and vibrant discourse that had filled this place only days before. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, lingering like a bitter memory that refused to dissipate. where once the voices of scholars rose in spirited debate, now only the crackling of dying embers dared to speak. I paused in the center of what had been the heart of the library, the grand reading room where light had danced upon countless scrolls and manuscripts. The shelves were but skeletal remains, charred and collapsing, their precious contents turned to ash. My hands trembled as I touched the scorched wood, a futile gesture, perhaps, but one born of desperation to grasp something tangible, something real, of what had been lost. The weight of silence pressed upon me, a void carved by fire that seemed to swallow not only knowledge, but the very spirit of Alexandria. Yet, amid this devastation, I found a strange clarity. The silencing of the library's voices was not an end, but a transformation. Though the physical forms of wisdom had been consumed, their essence, the ideas, the questions, the relentless pursuit of truth lingered still in the spaces between the ruins. I bent to retrieve a fragment of parchment, its edges curled and blackened but still bearing the delicate script of a scholar long silenced. Fingers stained with ash, I read aloud, my voice cracking yet resolute, the words rising like a fragile flame against the overwhelming dark. "In knowledge lies the soul of our city," I recited, the phrase trembling through the quiet air. "Though walls may fall and scrolls may burn, the thought endures an eternal ember in the night." The sound of my voice seemed to breathe life back into the hollow chamber, a whispered defiance against oblivion. I was no longer merely a witness to destruction. I was its chronicler, its bearer of memory. Each line I spoke, each verse I composed was a beacon cast into the void, a promise that the spirit of this place would not perish with the flames. Outside, the night was heavy with smoke and ash, embers drifting like lost stars across the darkened sky. Celine stood vigilant at the library's ruined entrance, her silhouette sharp against the flickering glow. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering, scanned the horizon, guarding not just the remnants of stone and parchment, but the fragile hope that something enduring might yet rise from the ashes. I joined her briefly, the cold air biting through my tattered robes as we shared a moment of silent understanding. In her steadfast gaze, I saw mirrored the resolve that had taken root within me. This was no longer a battle merely for books and scrolls. It was a struggle for memory itself, for the soul of a civilization that refused to be extinguished. Returning to the small fire we had kindled beyond the ruins, I unfurled a fresh scroll and dipped my quill into ink. The flickering light cast long shadows over the charcoal-streaked page as my hand moved with renewed purpose. Each verse was a testament to loss and resilience, a weaving of sorrow and hope that sought to capture the ineffable, the knowledge that even in silence, stories endure. The night deepened, but my resolve did not waver. Around me, the city of Alexandria slept uneasily, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place in the heart of its ruin. I wrote not for the present, but for the future, for those who would come seeking the truth long after the flames had cooled and the stones had crumbled. In the echo of silence, I heard the faintest stirrings of a new dawn. The library's voice may have been stilled, but its story was far from over. Words would carry its flame, undying and unyielding, through the darkness and into the light ahead. And so, with trembling hands but an unbreakable spirit, I committed my verses to the fragile scrolls, weaving the echoes of this lost world into a tapestry that no fire could consume. For in every end lies a beginning, and in every silent hall, the promise of a voice yet to be heard. As the embers faded into the cold night, I whispered a final vow to be the keeper of memory, the guardian of stories, and the poet of the burning library. Though the voices have fallen silent, the song of knowledge will endure. The journey was far from over, and the night held many secrets yet to reveal. But as I gazed upward, the stars above Alexandria shimmered with quiet brilliance, a cosmic witness to the eternal flame of human thought. And in that light I found my hope. The story would continue, beyond ashes and silence, carried by the steadfast heart of those who dare to remember. The crackling blaze had reduced walls to rubble and scrolls to dust, but it could not quench the fire within my soul. Each word written, each verse spoken, was a beacon of defiance and affirmation that knowledge, though vulnerable, was not vanquished. The library's silence was profound, yet it echoed with the weight of centuries of wisdom, now entrusted to memory and verse. It was a silence filled with absence, yes, but also with the promise of return. For as long as stories were told, as long as voices rose in remembrance, the library would live on not as stone and parchment, but as the eternal flame of human intellect and spirit. And in that quiet I found a new beginning. The air was thick with smoke, acrid and choking, yet my hand would not cease its trembling dance across the delicate scroll. Around me, the great library, once a sanctuary of wisdom, had become a crucible of flame and ash. The roar of fire clawed at the vaulted ceilings, a furious beast devouring centuries of human thought. Yet within this inferno, I found a strange clarity. I was no longer merely a witness, but a scribe of memory, a keeper of the last breath of Alexandria's intellect. I crouched low near the shattered remains of a great oak shelf, its charred bones still glowing faintly beneath the ashen dust. The parchment before me was fragile, crinkling under my fingers like dry leaves in the wind, but it was my lifeline. Each word I penned was a defiant ember against the consuming darkness. When all is lost, the word remains, I murmured, tasting the truth of those words even as the smoke stung my eyes. Celine's voice cut through the chaos, a steady beacon. "Stay close, poet," she urged, her tone both commanding and protective. I looked up to see her silhouette etched against the flickering firelight, her stance unwavering. Her presence was a shield in this madness, a reminder that even as the city burned, some still fought to preserve what remained. Callimachus appeared beside me, leaning heavily on his staff, his white beard streaked with soot. His eyes, sharp despite age and wear, met mine with a grave solemnity. "There is a hidden alcove," he whispered, voice trembling yet resolute. "A place untouched, where some scrolls yet survive. We must reach it before the flames close the path." Together, we moved through the labyrinthine corridors, the heat intensifying, the fire's roar swelling to a deafening crescendo. The walls seemed to breathe smoke and despair, but within me, a stubborn flame of hope kindled. I clutched my precious scrolls tighter, the weight of centuries of knowledge pressed into fragile sheets of parchment. In the alcove Nerissa awaited, her young face illuminated by the firelight's dance. She bent over her work, copying my verses with painstaking care. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve was fierce. "These words will live," she said, softly, eyes glistening with tears and determination. "I will carry them forward, even if all else is lost." A sudden crash echoed behind us, the library's heart succumbing to the blaze. Yet in that moment, surrounded by ruin and ruin's smell, I felt the power of the word. It was not flesh and wood that made a legacy endure, but memory spirit, the unyielding human will to remember and to bear witness. I wrote then with all the strength left in me, weaving verses that spoke of loss and defiance, of fire's fury and the quiet resilience of thought. Each line was a promise, fragile as the parchment but bold as the city's dream, that knowledge, though battered and scarred, could outlast the fiercest flame. Outside, Celine called urgently, "Time is short!" I gathered the scrolls, heavy with the weight of hope and history. The flames licked nearer, but I stepped forward, carried by the courage of those who stood beside me. The great library, in all its glory, was dying, but its soul, the immortal fire of intellect, would live on through these last verses. As we fled into the smoky night, the roar of destruction behind us, I knew this was not an end, but a beginning. The words I carried were a torch passed in darkness, a fragile beacon for the dawn yet to come. And so I write even now, knowing that though the library falls, the human spirit, eternal and unyielding, survives in the breath of every story told. Every verse committed to memory, every whisper of hope against the silence of oblivion. This is my testament. This is the last verse of Alexandria's burning library. The air was thick with choking smoke, a bitter taste of ash filling my lungs as I stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors of the great library. The once majestic halls, lined with shelves that had held the wisdom of ages, were now collapsing around me in a cacophony of cracking timbers and falling plaster. My hands trembled as they clutched the precious bundle of scrolls, fragile vessels of memory, the few verses I had managed to weave in secrecy. Every breath was a struggle, every step burdened by the weight of despair and hope intertwined. Beside me, Celine moved with the grace and urgency of a warrior born. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the shadows for threats both natural and human. "Stay close," she urged, her voice firm but not without warmth. "The flames are not the only danger tonight," I nodded, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in my throat. The city around us was unraveling, its hubris consumed not only by fire but by chaos and desperation. We darted past a fallen beam, Celine steadying me as the world around us trembled. I could hear the distant roar of the blaze, swallowing the heart of Alexandria. The crackle of flames mingling with cries of panic and the shouts of men driven mad by loss. "This way," Celine commanded, pulling me toward a narrow passage known only to a few. She had promised to guide me safely beyond the inferno, and I clung to that promise like a lifeline. As we neared the outer gates, the night air grew cooler, but the danger sharpened. A group of looters had gathered, their faces twisted by greed and fear. They barred our path, crude weapons gleaming in the flickering light. Celine stepped forward, her stance unwavering. "You will not harm this man or what he carries," she declared, her voice ringing with authority forged in years of duty. The looters hesitated, caught between their desperation and the fierce determination in Celine's eyes. A tense silence fell, broken only by the distant crackle of the dying library. Slowly, they parted, allowing us passage. Beyond the gates, shadows embraced us. The merchant waited as promised, his rugged features barely visible under the dim canopy of stars. We exchanged hurried whispers, the urgency of our task pressing down like the smoke still choking the air. One by one, the scrolls were transferred to trusted couriers, their hands steady despite the peril. I stood for a moment, breathing deeply, the cold night air a stark contrast to the inferno left behind. The weight of loss pressed heavy upon my chest, yet within the fragile parchment lay a fragile promise, a defiance against oblivion. Though the great library had fallen, its essence might yet endure, carried in words immortal and unyielding. Celine's gaze met mine, fierce and resolute. "We live to remember," she said simply. I nodded, the ember of hope kindling within the ashes of despair. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the flame of knowledge, once thought lost, now flickered faintly in the dark, and as the city smoldered behind us, I knew that our flight was not just an escape, it was the first step in the long resistance of memory against the silence of oblivion. The night was far from over, but for the first time in days, I dared to believe that words might yet outlast the fire. The corridors had become a labyrinth of shadows and smoke, each step a gamble against falling debris and encroaching flame. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drum that matched the crackling roar around us. Celine's hand was firm on my shoulder, guiding me with a certainty I lacked. "This way," she whispered urgently, pulling me through a narrow archway hidden behind a toppled shelf. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, but the passage led toward the outer walls, a path to salvation. We paused briefly in a small alcove, and I unwrapped the bundle of scrolls I had so painstakingly compiled. The fragile parchment, inscribed with verses born of desperation and love for knowledge, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Each line was a thread spun from the tapestry of the library's soul, a testament to what once was and what might still be. "You must promise me," I said, looking into Celine's eyes, "that these words will live on, even if the walls fall." Her gaze softened, the fierce warrior melting into a guardian of memory. "I swear it." Outside, the sounds of chaos grew louder. The crack of collapsing beams, the shouts of fleeing citizens, and the ever-present hiss of flames devouring centuries of wisdom. Yet within that small alcove, time seemed to pause a fleeting sanctuary amid the ruin. "We cannot linger," Celine urged. "The merchant waits." We emerged into the night, the sky painted in hues of orange and red, the library's silhouette a jagged wound against the horizon. The scent of burning papyrus filled the air, a bitter perfume of loss. At the shadowed entrance of a narrow alley, the merchant awaited, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You have what we need?" he asked urgently. I nodded, handing over the scrolls with trembling hands. "These are the last verses. Guard them well." He took them without a word, slipping them into a hidden satchel. "They'll leave the city tonight." Relief crashed through me, mingling with the sorrow that clung to my bones. I turned to Celine, gratitude and exhaustion etched deep in my features. "Thank you." "For everything," she smiled briefly, the shadows softening the hardness in her eyes. "The fight is not over. But tonight, we have won a small victory." Together, we retreated from the burning city, the echoes of the great library's final moments etched forever in my memory. The scrolls in safe hands were more than ink and parchment, they were the fragile flame of human thought, a beacon to guide the future through the darkness. As the night deepened, I wondered what dawn might bring. But for now, the words survived, and with them, a promise that even in ashes, knowledge could endure. The acrid sting of smoke still lingered in the air as I stepped away from the ruinous heart of what once was the great library of Alexandria. The charred remains stretched before me like a wound upon the city's soul-blackened pillars, twisted iron, and heaps of smouldering parchment that whispered tales now silenced. The sky above was a heavy grey smeared with streaks of ash that floated like fragile ghosts. My breath came uneven, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, but amidst the ruin, a stubborn ember of resolve kindled within me. Celine's presence beside me was a steadying force. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering, scanned the devastated landscape with the same sharpness that had helped me navigate the chaos within those burning halls. She was more than a guardian of flesh and blood. She was a sentinel for the fragile future we both dared to hope for. In her hands, she carried a bundle of scrolls wrapped carefully in oilcloth, each one a fragile vessel of memory and defiance. The weight of those scrolls was nothing compared to the burden they symbolized. "They will not be forgotten," I said softly, reaching out to take the precious cargo. Our fingers brushed, a silent pact forged amid the ruin. "These words, they are all we have left." Her nod was firm, but her gaze betrayed the sorrow etched deep within. "And we will carry them through whatever comes." I found a quiet alcove nestled in the city's outskirts, away from the murmur of mourning crowds and the stifling heat of destruction. There, beneath the waning light of a wary sun, I unrolled one of the salvaged scrolls. The parchment was brittle, edges singed, but the words inscribed upon it glowed with a quiet defiance. I read aloud, my voice trembling yet resolute, weaving the verses that had become my sanctuary and my weapon against oblivion. Around me, the city's heart beat faintly, the soft rustling of fabric, the whispered prayers, the tentative sighs of those who remained. My words were a balm and a beacon, a fragile thread pulling us from despair toward hope. I spoke of loss, of fire and ash, but also of the indomitable spirit that clings to memory when all else is lost. Night descended, cloaking Alexandria in a velvet shroud scattered with stars. I lifted my gaze to the heavens, the same stars that had watched over the library in its glory and its fall. The weight of human hubris pressed upon my chest, the arrogance that believed knowledge was eternal, the neglect that allowed flames to consume our heritage. Yet within me burned a small flame, fragile but unyielding, the immortal nature of words. In that moment, beneath the vast, indifferent sky, I understood the true burden of memory. It was not merely to remember, but to carry forward, to breathe life into the ashes through stories, through verses, through the unbroken thread of human thought. The library's walls might crumble, its scrolls might turn to dust, but the essence of what it held could survive, carried in the hearts and minds of those who dared to remember. As dawn threatened the horizon, I folded the scroll close, a promise sealed in ink and hope. The path ahead was shadowed and uncertain, but I was no longer merely a witness to history's end. I was its keeper, its voice in the silence, its fragile flame against the coming dark. And so, with the burden of memory heavy upon my shoulders, I stepped forward into the uncertain dawn of a world reborn from its own ashes. The night pressed heavy with silence, yet within the small chamber at the edge of the city's ruins, a faint flicker of light pulsed steadily against the dark. Nerissa sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, a fresh sheet of parchment stretched before her, and the poet's verses, inked in hurried, trembling strokes, laid carefully to one side. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and old paper, a haunting reminder of what had been lost in the flames that had devoured the great library. Yet here, in this fragile refuge, the embers of knowledge glimmered anew. Her fingers, still stained with the black ink of her labor, moved with growing confidence and reverence as she traced the poet's words onto the clean page. Each letter was a deliberate act of defiance against oblivion, a testament to the enduring power of the written word. The lines flowed from her brush with a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the city itself, wounded but unyielding. Outside, the night cloaked Alexandria in a veil of mourning. The city's great halls had fallen silent, the voices of scholars stilled by the merciless blaze. But within Nerissa's vigil, there was a quiet rebellion, a promise that the flame of intellect, though battered, would not be extinguished. She paused, eyes lifting to the dim glow of a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the scattered scrolls and weathered tomes surrounding her. The lamp's flame danced gently, mirroring the fragile hope that sustained her. From the doorway, a figure emerged, slender, worn, yet resolute. The poet himself stood watch, his gaze heavy with the sorrow of loss, but brightened by the ember of hope kindled by Nerissa's dedication. His hands, once unsteady with exhaustion and grief, now steadied as he approached, his voice low and steady. "You carry more than words, Nerissa. You carry our memory." She met his eyes, her own reflecting the weight of that charge. "I will not let it fade. These verses, they are more than ink on parchment. They are the soul of Alexandria, the breath of our people. I will guard them as fiercely as you did." A faint smile touched the poet's lips, a rare light in the shadow of despair. "Then the fire still burns." Days folded into nights as Nerissa continued her vigil, the act of copying becoming a sacred ritual. Each word she transcribed was infused with a silent vow, a bridge between the past and the uncertain future. Outside, the city stirred slowly from its stupor. Survivors moved cautiously amid the ruins, their faces etched with grief and determination. Political factions bickered over the remnants of a shattered legacy, but within this quiet chamber, a new story was being woven, one of resilience and remembrance. One evening, as the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Nerissa stepped outside, clutching a bundle of scrolls pressed close to her chest. The cool night air was crisp, carrying the faint murmurs of a city mourning, and yet beginning to hope. She looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of dawn hinted at renewal. The weight of loss pressed upon her, but so too did the promise of what might yet be preserved. In that moment, she whispered a line from the poet's verses, a soft incantation against darkness. "Though all our tomes may burn, the words remain an eternal flame." Her voice, frail yet unwavering, carried through the stillness, a beacon for those who would come after. The vigil was hers now, a solemn duty and a sacred honor. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Nerissa resolved that the fire of knowledge would not die here, not while she held the flame aloft. The poet watched from the shadows, his heart heavy but proud. The legacy he had nurtured in the dying light of the great library was no longer his alone. It had passed into hands steady and sure, hands that would carry the story forward, across the ravages of time and turmoil. As the night deepened, the chamber became a sanctuary of whispered verses and quiet hope. The poet and his apprentice, bound by loss and purpose, faced the uncertain dawn together. The fire had consumed the past, but in their vigilance, the flame of intellect and memory endured, flickering yet unbroken, waiting to blaze anew. And so, in the shadow of destruction amid the ashes of a lost world, Nerissa's vigil began, a testament to the unyielding spirit of human thought. A promise that even in ruin, knowledge would rise again. But the night was not yet over, and the city's fate would still twist through shadows and light. The poet's verses, now entrusted to Nerissa's care, held the fragile hope of a future yet unwritten. What challenges lay ahead, no one could foretell. Yet, in the steadfast hands of the young scribe, the eternal flame of Alexandria's legacy burned on, a quiet defiance against the silence of oblivion. As Nerissa folded a newly completed scroll and set it carefully among the others, a sudden sound startled her, a distant echo of footsteps, or perhaps a whispered voice. She froze, senses sharpened. The city was waking. The morning air was heavy with ash and silence. I stood upon the ruins of the great library, my gaze drifting over the shattered stones and smoldering embers that once held the sum of human thought. The scent of smoke still clung stubbornly to the air, mingling with the salt of tears and the dust of dreams undone. Around me, the city stirred, but not with the vibrant energy that had long defined Alexandria. Instead, there was a muted grief, a slow reckoning settling into the bones of every stone and soul. Faces passed me in the streets, some familiar, many strangers, each etched with the same quiet devastation. Mothers clasped trembling children closer. Scholars, once proud and assured, now shuffled with bowed shoulders and haunted eyes. The marketplace, usually alive with the clamor of bargaining voices and the scent of spices, seemed subdued, as if the loss of the library's wisdom had drained the city's very breath. I wandered through the streets, my thoughts heavy. The verses I had penned in secret, hidden within fragile scrolls, felt both a weight and a lifeline. What good were words, I wondered, when the very foundations of our knowledge lay in ash? Yet still, within me stirred the stubborn flame of belief that though the buildings crumble and the scrolls burn, the essence of human thought could endure, carried forward by memory and story. The political winds that had long whispered through Alexandria's streets now howled with renewed fury. Within the marble halls of power, voices rose in heated debate, sharp and unforgiving. Dionysius, a man whose ambition often overshadowed his compassion, stood at the center of the storm. His rhetoric, laced with blame and self-justification, sowed division among the city's leaders. They quarreled over who bore responsibility for the catastrophe, their words like daggers aimed at a city already bleeding. I had glimpsed this fracture before, the fragile veneer of unity cracking under stress, but now it seemed a chasm, threatening to swallow us whole. I could see in Celine's eyes, fierce and unyielding, the battle she fought within herself between duty to a city unraveling and a deeper desire to protect what remained of its soul. She stood as a sentinel at the crossroads of destruction and renewal, her presence a beacon amid the discord. In the quiet sanctuary of a small chamber, away from the clamor of politics and panic, I found Celine and Nerissa. The young apprentice, her fingers stained with ink and trembling with the weight of responsibility, carefully sorted through the fragments we had salvaged. Each scroll, each fragment, was a precious ember of the past, fragile yet burning with potential. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows upon the walls, dancing like ghosts of the knowledge we had lost. These words Nerissa whispered, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. They will carry us forward, won't they? I nodded, pressing a hand gently to her shoulder. They must. For what else remains, if not the stories we tell and the memories we keep alive? Outside, the city gathered at dusk's edge. A silent vigil unfolded beneath the rain-washed sky, where countless voices rose in whispered prayer for the lost legacy. Mothers, soldiers, scholars, merchants, none spared the ache of that collective mourning. Their tears watered the ground where the great library had stood, and in that shared sorrow, something fragile and beautiful took root. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Alexandria, but for all who cherish knowledge. The flames had consumed our home of wisdom, but they had not claimed our spirit. The verses I had written, the memories we held, were threads weaving a tapestry of resilience. Though broken, this city, this people, would endure. Political strife would rage, and grief would linger, but beneath it all was the quiet pulse of hope. I carried that hope like a fragile scroll, tucked close to my heart, and vowed to keep writing to bear witness, to defy oblivion with the power of words. As the night deepened, I looked once more toward the horizon where the first stars appeared. In the distance, the city's fires burned low, but within me burned a steadier flame, the eternal fire of memory, knowledge, and the unyielding human spirit. Whatever came next, I knew this was not the end. It was a beginning. The night was deep, and the only light in the small chamber came from a flickering oil lamp whose flame wavered like a living thing, casting restless shadows against the cracked plaster walls. Around us lay scattered scrolls, their fragile forms curling in the faint draught that slipped through the broken window. The scent of smoke still lingered, a reminder of the inferno that had claimed the great library but hours before. In this fragile sanctuary, Nerissa bent over a fresh piece of parchment, her fingers stained with ink and trembling slightly as she copied the verses I had composed. The quiet scratch of her reed pen was the only sound, a fragile defiance against the silence of loss. I watched her, the promise in her youthful eyes a balm for my weary soul. Our world had been torn asunder. The voices of scholars silenced, the scrolls reduced to ashes and ash-stained dreams. Yet, here we were, two figures illuminated by the faint glow of words that dared to endure when stone and wood had been consumed. The thought swelled within me. Storytelling was more than mere record. It was resistance. It was a shield raised against the oblivion that the flames sought to impose. A sudden rumble echoed distantly through the city, a low, guttural reminder that chaos still reigned beyond these walls. My hand trembled, the weight of despair pressing upon me, but I dipped my pen anew into the ink, the dark liquid pooling as if to swallow the fear. I wrote, each stroke of the reed a small rebellion against the encroaching darkness. The ink bled into the parchment like blood into earth, yet it was life in form, in thought, in memory. Why do you write, even now? Nerissa's voice broke the silence, soft and curious. I paused, meeting her gaze, and the flicker of uncertainty vanished from my eyes. Because words survive where walls fall, I answered. Stories carry the breath of those who came before us. They gather the scattered fragments and bind them into new shapes, new life. The fire can consume the scrolls, but it cannot consume the memory we carry in our hearts. She nodded, her face illuminated by the lamp's glow, a fierce determination settling upon her youthful features. Then we will tell the stories. We will keep the fire alive. The weight of loss pressed heavily upon me. I thought of Callimachus, his steady voice echoing in the corridors now silent. Of Selene, whose shield had guarded me through the flames. Of the countless scholars whose wisdom had been etched onto scrolls now lost to smoke and ash. Yet, even as sorrow seeped into my bones, hope stirred. Memory was a fragile flame, yes, but one that could be kindled anew. It was a fire not of wood or parchment, but of spirit and will. In this moment, I vowed to carry it forward, to pour the essence of Alexandria's intellect into verses that might one day kindle minds long after the city's stones had crumbled. I spoke aloud, my voice steady despite the tremor beneath. We are the keepers now, Nerissa, the guardians of thought and story. Through us, the library lives not in walls or scrolls, but in the breath of words, carried across time. She smiled a smile tempered by grief, but shining with resolve. Then let us begin anew. Outside, the first light of dawn seeped softly through the cracked window pane, brushing the room with pale gold. The city beyond was wounded, yet it breathed. Within this small chamber, surrounded by the remnants of what once was, two figures sat together, weaving a tapestry of words that would outlast fire and ruin. The night's silence was broken not by despair, but by the scratch of ink, the whispered promise of stories yet to be told. And in that sound the eternal flame of human thought flickered, fragile, yes, but unyielding. As I dipped my pen once more, the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only slightly. For in the act of writing, in the very defiance of the written word, I found a beacon. The flames may rage, but words endure. Through them, we resist oblivion. Through them, we live on. The road ahead was uncertain, the ruins of Alexandria a stark testament to loss and hubris. Yet, within these verses lay a promise, a fragile light in the encompassing dark. And as long as that light burned, so too would the spirit of the great library, whispered from one heart to another, carried on the wings of memory and hope. This was our resistance, this was our salvation. And so, the poet and his apprentice continued, weaving words into a shield against the night, knowing that though the library had fallen, the fire within the mind would never be extinguished. The first light of dawn crept tenderly over the shattered skyline of Alexandria, casting a pale gold hue upon the smouldering bones of the great library. The air was heavy with the scent of ash, mingled with the faint, hopeful aroma of wildflowers blooming resiliently amid the ruins. Survivors gathered in small clusters across the open square, where once proud colonnades had stood, their faces etched with the deep lines of grief yet softened by a fragile but growing determination. I sat quietly on a low stone bench, my scrolls carefully bundled beside me, the ink still fresh on the fragile parchment. Around me, familiar figures emerged from the shadows of devastation. Nerissa, her eyes wide with both sorrow and resolve. Selene, ever vigilant despite the exhaustion evident in the set of her jaw. And Callimachus, his white beard a stark contrast to the blackened remnants of our once gleaming halls. As the city stirred awake, the silence was broken by my voice, raised not in desperation, but in a measured cadence that carried the weight of loss and the promise of renewal. I read aloud the verses I had painstakingly woven through nights fraught with smoke and fear, words that had become my refuge and my rebellion against the all-consuming flames. Each line was a thread, binding us together in shared memory and unyielding hope. The listeners leaned in, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of dawn and the flickering hope ignited in their hearts. Among them, Nerissa held her scroll close, absorbing every syllable as if it were a sacred incantation. The poet's verses had become more than mere words. They were a beacon in the encroaching darkness, a testament to what we had lost and what we might yet preserve. Around us, the city's breath seemed to steady, the murmur of voices rising in cautious optimism. This fragile community, forged in the crucible of destruction, began to envision a future where knowledge would not be extinguished but rekindled. Nerissa approached me later, her hands stained with ink, the trembling of youth tempered by an emerging steeliness. "Teach me to carry these words," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I saw in her the embodiment of continuity, the living bridge between what was and what could be. Together, we unfurled the scrolls beneath the flickering candlelight of a humble shelter, each copied verse a deliberate act of defiance against oblivion. Outside the shelter, Selene patrolled the perimeters, her sharp eyes cutting through the morning mist. She was more than a protector. She was a guardian of the fragile promise we clung to. Her presence reminded us that safeguarding knowledge required both pen and sword, intellect and strength. We were united not just by loss, but by the fierce will to endure. Callimachus, ever the steady hand, spoke quietly beside me as we watched Nerissa work. "The flame is small now," he said, "but it is ours to nurture. From these ashes, the future scholars of Alexandria will rise, if we are steadfast." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within me. The library as it had stood was gone, but the intellectual fire that burned within our minds and hearts could not be so easily snuffed out. My verses, carried now by Nerissa and others who believed, were the sparks that might ignite a new dawn. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the battered city, I allowed myself a rare smile. The promise of dawn was not merely the arrival of light after night, but the rekindling of a collective spirit. Our story was far from finished. With each word preserved, each memory shared, we defied the darkness that sought to claim us. The flames had consumed the flesh of Alexandria's great intellect, but the soul, the eternal fire of human thought, remained, flickering fiercely within us all. And so, as the city stirred to life once more, I vowed to keep writing, to keep weaving verses that would outlast stone and flame. For in words there is immortality, in memory resistance, and in hope the promise of dawn. Smoke still hung like a shroud over the city, curling in restless spirals against the darkening sky. The charred bones of the great library lay scattered beneath my feet, a ruin that once pulsed with the heartbeat of all human thought. Around me the air tasted bitter and heavy, thick with the scent of ash and loss. Yet in the silence that followed the inferno's rage, I found a strange clarity, a stillness that spoke not of surrender, but of a promise whispered on the wind. I stood there, wrapped in my threadbare robes, the weight of all that was lost pressing upon my shoulders, like the centuries-old tomes that had succumbed to flame. The scrolls, the writings, the wisdom painstakingly gathered from the corners of the world, all reduced to smoke and memory. Yet even as despair threatened to engulf me, my hands trembled not in defeat, but with the lingering warmth of resolve. Words, I believed, held a power beyond fire. They were not mere ink and parchment, but vessels of the human soul, fragile yet unyielding, capable of outlasting the fiercest blaze. The verses I had scribed in secret scrolls, the fragile threads of knowledge woven by quiet hands, were now entrusted to Nerissa, a young scribe whose eyes shone with a fierce light despite the ruins. She moved with care, unrolling my verses beneath the waning light, her fingers trembling but steady. Each stroke of her pen was a defiant act, a promise that the story of Alexandria and its burning heart would not be forgotten. She is the keeper now, the bearer of a legacy forged in sorrow and hope alike. Selene stood at the city's edge, her silhouette framed by the dying embers of the fire. Her gaze was sharp, unwavering, a sentinel guarding not just the remnants of stone and scroll, but the spirit of a city battered by its own hubris. In her stance, I saw the unspoken vow to protect what remained, to defend the fragile ember of culture from the winds of oblivion. Callimachus, ever the wise and steady presence, had passed his knowledge and calm to me in those final hours. His counsel echoed in my mind that memory and story are the true libraries, built not of marble and ink but of human hearts and voices. It is these that endure, carried forward by those who remember and bear witness. As night deepened, I found a quiet corner far from the ruins, seated beneath a battered archway where the shadows danced faintly in the flickering torchlight. I recited my final verses aloud, words born of fire and loss, of sorrow entwined with a stubborn hope. The sound carried softly across the empty streets, a fragile beacon in the dark, each syllable a spark, each line a flame defying the cold silence. Though stone may crumble and scrolls may burn, the fire of thought shall ever return. From ashes rise, in hearts ablaze, the eternal flame of human gaze. I paused, breath mingling with the night air, feeling the weight of centuries and the promise of those yet to come. The great library may have fallen, but the intellectual fire it nurtured could not be extinguished. It lived within us in the memories we hold, the stories we tell, the words that endure beyond time and ruin. And so, with the dawn yet to break, I closed my eyes and let the verses carry me forward. For in the end, it is not the grandeur of stone or the thickness of scrolls that define us, but the eternal flame of ideas burning bright, resilient, and unyielding against the darkness. The story of Alexandria has ended, but the story of human thought is infinite. And as long as there are those who remember and dare to dream, the flame will never die. I rise from the ashes, carrying the fragile light into the uncertain dawn, a poet bound by loss, but driven by hope, ever the keeper of the eternal flame.